For Zen Orientalism. Bernard Faure describes the next stage of study as Zen Orientalism, when Zen came to be an object of discourse in the West. The interest was a result of the work of D.T. Suzuki. He had enormous influence in the introduction of Zen and Shin ideas to an English reading public. In Japan he was never part of the major academic community of Buddhist specialists in national or sectarian universities. For this Japanese scholarly community, the Zen study that attracted the most attention was that of the philosopher at Kyoto University, Nishida Kitaro. The question which emerged from the work of these two scholars and those who used their works, was whether the teachings of Zen are outside of any historical or cultural context as contrasted with being a part of a historical lineage of masters. Nishida tied Zen philosophy to pure experience. This pure experience is free of cultural context. However, the role of the lineage of teachers in Shin and Zen has never been replaced by the philosophical approach. In China, an important figure among the intellectuals of the first part of the 20th century was Shih. He had studied in the US and returned to China with his academic training combined with the classical work that he had done within the traditional system of study in his country. Shih had a strong sense of the history of China, and he saw Indian Buddhism as a virus which had infected the nation. Shin was the Chinese correction of Indian excesses of mysticism. Shin was practical. His work in the US may have shown most clearly when he declared that Shen-hui was a revolutionary figure, another reformer. When Shih started to look at the Shin documents of the Dunhuang collection, he negated the traditional histories and looked to construct a true history of Shin. His attempt to construct a true history pointed toward the importance of the Chinese cultural influences within Shin and the turn away from the older Indian forms of the religion. V. Chosun, Zen, Sen, Zen, Buddhism. When we turn out attention to the Chosun, Zen, period in Korea, we can see how the local situation helped to determine the way in which Buddhism was studied. Each culture of East Asia gave Buddhism a different position at given times and places. The Mongols gave it a very high place in their court life and provided support for the practices which they had inherited from Tibet. Among the Han people, the attitude toward the religion was mixed. There was a bias against the teachings and practices, especially among many of the officials and literati. At the same time, there was a willingness to have a variety of religious expressions existing side by side within the general practices of Chinese religion. Buddhism had a secure place among the people, and for certain issues, it was a primary focus. While some of the elite of the learned community considered the teachings to be inferior to the Chinese philosophies, monasteries, where Shin was practiced, abounded, and received great support from a wide spectrum of society. Japanese Buddhism had been adopted by the court during the Nara period and thereafter retained a place in the center of Japanese intellectual and religious life. Unlike China, there was no elite community that considered it to be inferior. This meant that Japan was to be the nation with the best scholastic basis for the study of Buddhism. The tradition has been a part of the curriculum of universities for centuries, including the national system of higher education. How different was the case of Korea? The Chu-Shi school of Confucian thought came to dominate the official life of the Chosun, Zen, Korean court and the leaders in the provinces of the nation. Buddhism, the religion of the previous Koryo dynasty, was rejected, and in many ways the recording of Korean Buddhist history was suspended. The tradition was seen as a decadent remainder of the power it had held in the preceding dynasty. Monks and nuns were forbidden to enter the capital and other major cities, The educational system no longer included the Buddhists, and support from officials ceased. Korean historians who were part of the dominant Confucian supporters, gave scant attention to Buddhism in the national annals. For those who based their understanding of the history of Korean on these records, it appeared that Buddhism was a rejected and minor aspect of the life of the people. This characterization of Korean Buddhism continued into the 20th century, and so Europeans and North Americans found little to interest them. Until more recent times, Korean Zen was not a part of the research of scholastic endeavor either in universities or colleges of Korea or those abroad. 6. Contemporary studies. There has been an improvement in this scholarship during the last quarter of the 20th century, and we have seen the publication of a series of monographs that have advanced our knowledge about Seon, Zen, and Zen, far beyond the previous understanding. Paul Demievely was an important person, Zen, in making the study of all available documents for an understanding of the Seon history in China. He followed the French approach to look at the ethnographic as well as the textual sources for a study of the tradition. This was a reconstruction of the history not totally dependent upon the received tradition of the Seon movement. Of great importance was the discovery of Seon texts in Cave 17 at Dunhuang. These Dunhuang documents have helped scholars to revise the history of Seon, and to see it as a much more complex and multifaceted movement than was previously thought. Other scholars have pursued similar strategies of looking at the full range of available documentation for the study of particular aspects of the Seon, whether it be the teachings of a particular master, the rules of conduct, or the cultural application of the practice. Some of these, and this is not a complete list, include Karl Bielefeld, Martin Calcutt, Bernard Faure, Luis Gomez, Griffith Falk, John McCrae, Philip Yampolsky, and others who are present at this conference. We have moved far beyond the previous understanding of Seon. In most instances, contemporary study of Seon has developed in Japan, and these scholars were strongly influenced by contacts with the important Japanese scholars who looked to the Chinese material. There was no comparable study to this Chinese work for Korea among the Japanese scholars. A few good works were done, such as those of Professor Kamada, but no critical mass of scholarship has ever developed in Japan for the Korean tradition. The Japanese approach to Seon has also had some limitations. Because Zen in Japan is sectarian with separate ordination from other Buddhist groups, Seon in China is viewed as the forerunner of what happened in Japan. It is the history of Seon which was of interest, and not the practice or the fact that Seon had a widespread and continuing pattern of development. After the introduction of Seon into Japan, and the establishment of the institutions of the Zen monasteries, less attention was paid to the subsequent developments in China. Japanese scholars have produced few studies of contemporary Seon or even Seon of the period after the Sung. Once the transmission was complete, attention was turned to Japan itself and not to the continuing developments of other forms of the tradition in China and Korea. This is one of the reasons, why the study of Seon has seldom been extended to the contemporary practices and development. The work of breaking through to a new era of study for Korean Buddhism and the Zen tradition has come from a small group of scholars. In the 1960s and 70s, dissertations were written that provided the first substantial information on the history and practices of Zen. The first was done by So Kyungbo, who made a study of the Kodang heap in 1960, and nearly 2 decades later Shim J. Ryong followed this up with a first introduction to Chinul, and in the same year Sung Bae Park dealt with the role of Wonhye in the development of Korean Buddhist schools, and Hee Sung Keel investigated the role of Chinul. Work on Chinul continued with the publications of Robert Buswell. This group of scholars received their training in Korea and North America. They were not part of that group of North American and European scholars who did part of their graduate research in Japan. This small band of scholars had to develop their own approach, and they have pioneered in the creation of the literature that has allowed students to begin the discovery of the importance of Korean Zen. We owe them a debt of gratitude for providing the scholastic entry into the study of this aspect of Korean Buddhism. The publications of these scholars gave a dimension to the study of Korean Zen, which had never been known in Europe or North America. This focus on those who published in English is not intended as a judgment of the work that was beginning to appear in Korean. Without the editions, translations, and histories that were published in Korean language volumes, the international community would not have been able to make the advances that they accomplished. Scholars such as An Chi-ho, Ri Ki-young, Kim Tien-ho, Han Ki-do, Yi Chong-ik, and others have given us invaluable aid in the hard task of mastering the textual material related to Zen. From these works done in the last half of the 20th century, we have a description of the history of the Zen movement. Robert Buswell has pointed out that the early introduction of Seon to Korea came before the Sixth Patriarch or the battles which followed between the northern and southern schools. If this history is correct, then Pomnang received his study under the Fourth Patriarch Tao Hsin. His students studied in the linear of the Second Patriarch of the Northern School. While the Korean Zen group of the Kochi order now traces its origins to the Southern School of Seon, the teachings were being transmitted in Korea at an earlier date than the time when this school came to dominate. The study of the ancient documents and the reconstruction of history based on all available sources has brought about a new understanding of how Korean Zen developed.